Well, welcome to episode 103 of 10 Minute Record Reviews. This time we're going to talk about the Rolling Stones' debut album, or at least the US version of the Rolling Stones' debut album, England's Newest Hitmakers. And what I have here is the first Canadian pressing, so I guess this is the first Canadian album of the Rolling Stones. Can't wait to review this one, and if you like what I'm doing here, please do subscribe. Just click on the little link at the top right of your screen or at the end of the video. In terms of what to expect from this album, it's a debut album, but it's already a transitional record. And that's, I guess, not too surprising because this is a band which really, at least for the first 20 years of its existence, was seemingly in transition all the time. Such was their musical curiosity and also their capacity to assimilate and master and deliver new styles. They were at this point being pushed in the direction of pop, but you can still feel very much that their comfort level is at its highest when they're playing straight up Chicago blues music. So the background to the Stones' first album has to start, I think, with Mick and Keith. They're both born in 1943 in the outskirts of London in a place called Dartford in Kent. Mick and Keith had been school friends but had drifted apart. Mick meets a guy called Dick Taylor in the 1950s and they're playing early rock and roll and Chicago blues. They eventually reconnect in 1961. Mick is carrying some records by Muddy Waters and Chuck Berry. Keith looks at these records, and of course, particularly the Muddy Waters record would have been quite a rare record for someone to have in Britain in 1961. Realizes they have quite common musical interests, and their friendship sparks up again. They start up a little band called Blues Boys. They send a tape to a guy called Alexis Corner, who has a bit of an unusual history. Alexis Corner was a little bit older than a lot of the guys who went on to form some of the most famous bands, not just in the British blues revival, but in rock and roll history. But although he convened a whole scene and he plays with all these folks, he himself never really achieves anything like the success or fame that any of his proteges or associates do. Anyway, in 1962, Corner's got an outfit called Blues Incorporated. Mick and Keith and their band send their tape to him. He hears it, he likes it, he says, hey, come to Ealing Jazz Club. Blues Incorporated are playing, you guys can jam, and so on. They show up, they meet him. They also meet three other guys who were playing with Corner at the time, and those include Ian Stewart on piano, Charlie Watts on drums, and a guy called Brian Jones who was playing slide guitar. This meeting leads to Mick and Keith starting to hang around and jam with Blues Incorporated. Around the same time, Brian Jones and Ian Stewart, known as Stu, leave Blues Incorporated. They go and form their own band, and eventually Mick and Keith and Dick Taylor leave Blues Incorporated and they go and join Stu and Brian. And adding a drummer by the name of Tony Chapman, these guys formed the band The Rolling Stones. They debut under that name in July '62 at the Marquee Club. Pretty soon after, Chapman and Taylor both leave, and in the winter of '62-'63, in come Bill Wyman on bass, and then Charlie Watts on drums. So now you've got a six-piece lineup: Charlie, Bill, Keith, Mick, Brian, and Stu, playing as the Rolling Stones. Their manager is a guy called Andrew Loog Oldham. He'd been a publicist for the Beatles. He was only 19, he was younger than most people in the band. The band is gigging and getting a lot of popularity, and Oldham tries to amplify that popularity by working on the band's image. Starts off having them dress in suits, but eventually he goes with an angle which is deliberately contrary to the Beatles, who of course were rising in fame at that time. Instead of suits, they were all dressed differently, and it was kind of a bad boy image that he was trying to cultivate. Oldham also felt that six was too many on stage, that Ian Stewart, who was a bit older than the rest of the guys, who was a little more heavy set, was probably the least teen idol worthy of anybody. So he got the band to agree to demote Stewart from being a full band member and playing piano to basically being the road manager, still playing the piano for really the next 20 years on so many Stones tracks. Amazingly, Stewart goes for this, just agrees to be the road manager, and was a loyal friend and part of the Stones scene for many, many years thereafter. Fall of '63, they put out a couple of singles, including Come On, which was a Chuck Berry cover. Touring in the strength of that, they released a couple of other singles that winter. I Want to Be Your Man, which was written by Lennon and McCartney and given to the Stones, and Not Fade Away, which is a Buddy Holly cover. Both of those songs charted, and in early 1964, they head into the studio to make their debut album. Decca Records had famously missed out on the Beatles. The contract the Stones eventually signed with them is super generous compared to what most other novice artists were signing. They had a great royalty rate, they kept their master tapes, they had total artistic control, and they could record their music with any producer and in any studio they wanted. They weren't restricted to working in Decca's facilities. So they choose to record the album at Regent Sound Studios, and it's done over 5 days, stretching from January to February 1964. The production is handled by Oldham and Eric Easton. It's a little bit patchy, it's got its highs and lows. Not surprising, I guess, given the inexperience of some of the team here. But what comes through in this album is the energy. They hadn't known each other necessarily for that long. Mick and Keith had, but in general, the band had been together for about a year, or maybe even less in the case of some of the players. But they had been gigging absolutely nonstop that whole period, and this is effectively their live set poured out onto vinyl. The album's got 9 covers and 3 originals, although it really only has 1 original, Tell Me, because the other 2 are group compositions, and both of those, as I'll discuss later, are pretty derivative of other artists' songs. The only actual composition by any of the band members is Jagger and Richards' Tell Me. The way the songs are recorded tends to reflect their experience as a live band. Most of the covers they do are faster than the originals, mainly because they were typically playing to an audience of teenagers and they needed to keep the energy levels up, and that just comes through. Sometimes I find they sound a little bit rushed. It might have been better for the album versions to have slowed them down, but this was how they were used to playing them. This version, the US/Canadian version, includes Not Fade Away, which of course is a Buddy Holly tune done in the style of Bo Diddley. The song which it replaces from the UK version is Mona, I Need You Baby, which is actually a Bo Diddley composition. So side 1 starts with that song Not Fade Away, which of course had been a successful single for the Stones, the Buddy Holly cover. A song which bears some of the hallmarks I was talking about before with respect to their live shows. It feels a little bit rushed. This is a fairly faithful cover, but I think a slightly inferior version to the Buddy Holly outing. The next song I think is a really great cover, and that's Bobby Troupe's song, Route 66. I think it shows the advantage the Stones have relative to most of their competitors, even the Beatles, in terms of the quality of guitarists they actually had in the band at the time. It's also kind of funny because you have Mick with his English accent trying to pull off all these American pronunciations of towns and not really getting it. So you get Flagstaff, Arizona, and things like that, which makes me chuckle every time. Followed by Willie Dixon cover, I Just Want to Make Love to You. This is much sped up from the original. I think to the detriment of the song, frankly. You can argue that it's very English to deliver a song about lust in a very frantic and hurried way, but in any event, could have slowed it down a touch. Next song on the cover, Honest I Do. This is basically an unremarkable R&B tune, and it's a good performance, but no more than that. Side 1 concludes with 2 group compositions. First of those is Now I've Got a Witness. This is basically a riff on Can I Get a Witness, which is a Marvin Gaye song written by Holland, Dozier, and Holland, which appears on side 2. And the side concludes with Little by Little, which is a 12-bar blues with some extended instrumental sections. It's a nice workout, not necessarily too groundbreaking. Side 2 starts with what I think is the absolute best track on the whole album, one of the highlights of the Stones' early career, which is I'm a King Bee, which is a cover of a Slim Harpo tune. This is produced beautifully. You can absolutely hear all the different instruments, and the performances are excellent, including Keith's little hammer-ons during the main riff, and then Brian playing some excellent slide guitar. Bill Wyman, too, totally shines here. He's doing these big slides on bass, and I don't know a lot of people who are big Stones fans who don't really love this track. Then they're covering Chuck Berry with Carol. I always kind of like the version they do on Get Your Yayas Out some years later, the live album in New York, which is a very languid, almost lazy effort, but which comes across as much lustier and sleazier than this version, which has still got that kind of frantic feel, as I mentioned. And now we arrive at Tell Me, which is the very first effort by Mick and Keith at writing a song. Apparently, Oldham locked them in a kitchen and said, don't come out until you've written some songs that can compete with what Lennon and McCartney are coming up with, and this was the best they could do. I think you'd have to say it feels a bit like an undergraduate poetry effort. Then we have the Marvin Gaye track, Can I Get a Witness? This has Ian Stewart on piano. This is one of the best tracks in the album. Then another R&B cover, You Can Make It If You Try. This is an okay cover of a pretty good R&B song. Again, a bit of an uncertain delivery from Mick. The album ends with one of the real high points, and the only other song which I would say competes with I'm a King Bee for best song of the album, and that is Rufus Thomas's song, Walking the Dog. This is so great. Mick is totally in his element here. He's got this great double entendre lyric to play with. I think in general he's much more confident in the upbeat numbers at this stage. Keith is laying down this simple blues riff which totally works. It's an infectious tune. It's a tune you'll want to play again and again. A great way to end the album. It's not the strongest album in their catalog or even in their early catalog, but it is still a pretty strong album, and it's got some real high points. And I think as we look back with historical perspective, it really does fare well when set against some of its competitors in the English beat revolution at the time. I think this measures up pretty well to anything the Beatles did, up to but not including Hard Day's Night. I think it also measures up really well against anything the Yardbirds were doing at the time. It is the first major branching off in the British pop world from mainstream pop music towards blues-based rock and roll. And of course that branching off would lead not just to the Stones' greatest work, but would also lead to Cream, Free, Led Zeppelin, and so many different bands whose approach collectively would dominate the music of the early to mid 1970s. They'd get a lot better, they'd write more of their own songs, not just good songs, but great songs, some of the greatest songs in history, and their performances would also get a lot more assured. But even here, they're doing pretty darn well, and this is worth 4 to 5 stars.